Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to our CM2 very first round back event this semester. We have two presentations and three speakers, I guess. First one by Professor Sandra Rosenbloom, and then the second one by Mashur or Sierra together.
Oh, that'd be
So, yeah, round back is rather an informal discussion. People come here, exchange ideas, reporting work in progress, or complete works, or forthcoming projects, and exchange ideas, asking for advices, suggestions for researchers on some issues. Typically, for example, getting data or getting the right person to so first one, please.
Hi. So we have, Ming has allowed me to start something called the Safe and Healthy Aging Lab as part of CM2. And our goals are to learn how to get typos out of PowerPoints. We're going to be talking to a lot of agencies in the Texas Triangle. We've been working with some already, and to provide assistance and work with them on meeting senior mobility needs. We're going to conduct unpaid exploratory research on senior safety and mobility in the hopes of gaining additional research funds. So, to get the nose of the camel under the tent. And we're going to have a series of policy pieces, little pieces on the website when it goes active. It's not quite active yet, on interesting questions, things that are going on. And so I'm going to tell you about one of the things that's going to go up on the website, which is something about traffic safety issues for seniors in Texas and nationally. So most seniors are drivers, and most people hit 65 already having been a driver for most of their lives. And most seniors, in spite of what you've heard, are good drivers. They have less accidents, fewer accidents than 18 to 25-year-old males. And in fact, most state departments of transportation who spend their safety money on young people, not on old people, because older people are good drivers and they don't drive a lot, so they don't have a lot of crashes. But their skills do, on average, their skills decline as they age, and they may have financial pressures, especially women keeping a car. So eventually they reduce and stop driving. But the problem is that not just in Texas, but across the country, over 75% of people over 65 live in low density places, suburbs or rural areas. And so when they stop driving, it's a very serious problem because they become isolated. It's not just, people talk a lot about how they won't get to the doctor. Actually, they don't have that much trouble getting to the doctor because they don't go every day to the doctor. But they do need interaction every day. They do need to get out in the community and see other people. Seniors are wonderful volunteers. A lot of seniors are raising, 12% of seniors are raising their own grandchildren. They not only are they volunteers, some of them are still in the workforce. So as they lose the ability to either physically, mentally drive or financially afford a car, there's some real problems. So there's a lot of focus on older drivers and if they are safe or not. And so I want to share some of those data with you. So these are licensing figures for, can you see them or no? People are going like this. What surprised me when I did this was, though the years are not the same, the US data are from 2016, the Texas data are from 2017. It turns out that fewer senior Texans are licensed to drive than nationally. And I'm not sure what's going on there, but I have a feeling some of it is people who are undocumented. I have a feeling there's people out there driving without licenses. That certainly when I was in Arizona and was doing work, similar work, we found a lot of Hispanic older folks that were driving but didn't have. And some of them were actually documented, but they'd never gotten a driver's license, so they never got a driver's license, but they were driving. So maybe that's some of what's going on here. I don't know. I was really surprised to see that overall, nationally, more drive. But still, these are high numbers. These are not small numbers. It's just that they're smaller than the U.S. numbers. Wait a minute, isn't that what's going on here? So people talk about the U curve in traffic safety. So this is dry, and there are a lot of ways to look at safety data, and it's really important to understand what it is. So these are drivers who were involved in a fatal crash. It does not mean the driver was killed, it just means somebody in the vehicle was killed. And it does not mean the driver was at fault, okay? So you see there's a sort of U-shaped curve, but notice that it's not until people are 80 and older that that they have more crashes per 100,000 drivers than younger people. Can you see that? It's when they're 80 and 85. And the other message in this chart is the blue or the turquoise are men and the yellow are women. That is constant over 50 years. Women always have. Now these are women drive less, and so this is one measure. This is not exposure, this is just having a license, right? But still, it's men who are the problem. If you're worried about anybody out on the road, you need to focus on male drivers, not female drivers. And again, remember that this is not being at fault. This just means somebody died in a crash, and it's terrible that they died, but it doesn't mean it was their fault. So these are Texas fatalities. This is a different metric. It's the percentage of all fatalities in Texas by age compared to the licensing rate by age. And so you can see until people are 75 and above, they have fewer a driver fatality is the driver died. So different from before, the driver died in these fatalities. And again, this is not who's at fault. This is just who died. And so it's not until they're over 75 that the percentage of drivers of total driver fatalities in Texas is higher than the percentage of senior drivers out in the road. But still, it's not a lot. It's going down, right? It's, if you're worried about driving fatalities, you worry about younger people. You don't worry about older people. And yet the debate is so often framed. Some older driver will do something like drive on a pedestrian street and kill 5 people, which I'm not saying is a good thing. I'm not saying that driver should have been driving. But that's the exception that makes the news. And then everybody runs around, and I get a lot of calls from news media because I'm part of a very large group of traffic safety professionals that believe that older drivers should be encouraged to stay on the road and not driven out of their cars, in part because they're safe and in part because of the social isolation. We're not offering them anything to me. So if you look at this, older drivers are not a big problem here. Go ahead, Ming. Yeah.
For clarification, this one and the previous slide shows the fatality rate by the population in the cohort? Or
No, by the number of licensed drivers in the cohort.
in the cohort, within the
So
cohort.
it's not okay. So it's not exposure data. You don't. Let me go back here. You don't know how often these people are driving, but we do know. You don't know from these data, but we know from life that younger people are driving more because they're going to work and they're doing all these things. So this is not exposure. And if you, I was looking for an exposure one, couldn't find it. Exposure ones are a steeper U. But still, it doesn't start to go up above where kids are until they're about 75 or 80. Now, I mean, people who do traffic safety say anybody dying on the road, we want to have 0 deaths, right? That's the goal. But if you have limited money or you're concerned about crazy people out there driving on the road, it's not older drivers because they don't drink and drive, they don't drug and drive, though they do take medications, which is a problem. They wear their seat belts. They're safe drivers. They're to the extent they're at fault in crashes, it's because their eyesight is failing or they can't move their head quickly. It's not that they're doing what younger drivers are doing. They're not speeding, they're not drinking, they're not doing all those bad things. So it also means that to make older drivers safer, you use different methods than you use on the kids and that you use on younger drivers. So this is, again, per 100,000 drivers in the cohort, but not per exposure. And if it were per exposure, it would be a steeper curve.
Isn't there like an argument also that sometimes older drivers are unsafe because they're like get startled easily, or they'll like brake when they're not supposed to brake? Or,
Yeah, there's
slow
some.
down on
Yeah,
the
there are
highway?
problems. But a lot of those problems can be trained out of people, and that's actually more women than men. Women are very uncertain, and this has been for 50 years. All the studies show that women give up driving for not because they're sick or they say I don't feel right. Yeah. And part of that, seriously, is other people denigrating their driving, particularly their husbands. But on average, the data clearly show that the man is a worse driver than the woman. In any household, of course, it can be different, but the data clearly show that the male drivers are much more likely to be bad drivers than the women, but they relegate their women to the passenger seat. So the women are continually assaulted by this, you're not a good driver, you're a terrible driver. And in fact, while any one person can be, overall that's not true. So it's women who do funnier things because they don't have as much experience. And there's something called the low mileage bias. And we know that people who drive under 3,000 miles a year actually have more crashes per exposure than people who drive more. And that's because they're not practicing. And those are almost entirely women because the new NHTS data came out and showed what all the other national data has shown. If two people are in a car, a man and a woman, and they both have a driver's license, 80 to 90% of the time the man is driving. And we have found that in every national survey. So the women are not getting the experience they need not to make those kind of things, but they can be trained. And there's a lot of evidence that putting people into driving courses, there's a lot of demand now. People are calling driving schools, which have been focused on young people, they're calling driving schools when they're 70 or 75 and saying, I want to take a course. And of course, they have to be different. I mean, some material will be the same, but you can't treat an 18-year-old as you would an 80-year-old. So there are those issues. So these are U.S. data, and this is a change from 2007 to 2016. So the population of women over 65 went up 26% between 2007 and 2016. The population of men 65 plus went up 35%. And the licensed drivers went up faster among women than among men over 65. So we're still on the top of the chart. You with me on that? And the third column over is just to show you the total population. That's everybody. So you can see that the population of people over 65 is growing at 5 times the rate that the total population is growing. And some people call that the silver tsunami because birth rates have gone down, right? So, and if immigration continues to go down, this will intensify. There are countries like Japan and almost all the Scandinavian countries where the birth rate has been close to zero replacement, and there's a huge percentage of folks. The reason we don't look like Scandinavia is immigration, and if we cut off immigration, we're going to start to be a much older country. Okay, so what you can see in the top two lines is the substantial increase in the number, not drivers, just people, okay? Then, well, the top is people, the next one is licensed drivers, and it's going up faster among women than men. I think licensed because 20 years ago there was a substantial percentage of older women who did not have a license when they hit 65, and There's very few people who get a license after they're 65. It doesn't work that way. So let's look at the difference, however, in senior fatalities. These are just senior fatalities. So this is, the first one is where the driver dies. So that has not increased with the population of drivers. Only 6% increase in driver fatalities for women, 18% increase in driver fatalities over that 10-year period for men. But in the total population, driver fatalities went down 11%. So what you see is the population as a whole has fewer driver fatalities, but seniors have more, even if not substantially more. So PV occupant is private vehicle occupant died, not the driver, but the occupant. So among women that went down, among men it went down, it went up slightly for the total population. I think what's happening there is there's more people with no occupants in their cars. Those folks are drivers, not occupants anymore. Total traffic deaths of any kind in any mode only went up 4% among older women, went up 20% among older men, even while they're dropping 9% in the population as a whole. And the next line, the cyclists, the problem with the cyclists is there aren't many senior cyclists. So, if it goes to from 1 to 3, it went up 200%. But the pedestrian one is alarming, that the pedestrian rates have gone up, death rates have gone up so significantly, and they've gone up significantly for women. And one of the things people who promote active transportation need to remember is that it's much safer for an older person to be in a car than out on the streets. Of course, these are not exposure rates, so we don't know what it is per exposure, but there's a lot of older women out there dying as pedestrians, and these are not even good data. That's the other thing about traffic safety data, that if you're not hit by a car and you're not seriously injured as a pedestrian or a cyclist, the chances that your crash was recorded in official data is about 0. One of the presenters at the women's conference has data from San Francisco, and it's going to be a great data set because the city county of San Francisco owns all the Trauma One hospitals. So they've been comparing official traffic reports of deaths and serious injuries to hospital admissions, and it's like 4 to 1, which is what other studies are finding. In other words, for every person who shows up in the police database, there are 3 to 4 who were seriously enough injured to be admitted to an ER or to go to an ER. And so and these data are official police data, so they are undercounting significantly the number of pedestrian crashes. So this is a serious problem that's soaring, and it's soaring in the total population as well. So I wonder why that cut off the thing. Overall, the data show that older women, who are only 17% of the total population, account for 22% of all traffic fatalities. The comparable figure for men is they're 14% of the total population, but 18% of all traffic fatalities. That means they died, right? They didn't just get hurt, they died. And for all people over 65, they're 15% of the population, but 19% of all pedestrian fatalities. And these data are really interesting, that the older you get, the more likely you are to be killed as a pedestrian because you're frailer, and any injury to your body is much harder to recover from. So it turns out that older people have problems both as drivers and pedestrians. So what do we do next? Well, a lot of things, but I'm a big proponent of retraining drivers. There's a lot of evidence, not just classroom stuff. There's no evidence that helps at all. And there's actually some evidence that crash rates go up for people who have been in a classroom training situation. And we think what's happening is they feel more confident and they drive more. We need to have meaningful alternatives out there, and there'll also be something up on the website about how few alternatives there really are and how people are fooling themselves that there's really anything out there in the community. Most folks are in suburbia, and so I think we need to take a lot of issues We need to address making suburbia more active transportation friendly. And I'm a big proponent of it doesn't have to be utilitarian transportation, and I think it won't be. We have to just make it possible for people to go out and walk in their neighborhoods, even if they can't walk to a grocery store or the doctor. And there are not a lot of seniors who cycle, but we have to be looking at that too. We really need law enforcement, and I actually think overall planners don't talk about this enough. A lot of stuff we do in transportation, we need to be partners with law enforcement, and we're not. And I've been in very awkward meetings with law enforcement. They're not our kind of people and we're not theirs, but we need to be on the same page. We need to be stopping bad drivers. We need to also be enforcing pedestrian and cycling laws in a way that we're not. And we need better reporting systems so we have better data. Most of us are planners, and planners need data. If we don't know where crashes are really happening, if we're only relying on official data, which are bad and incomplete and focus largely on people hit by cars. But it turns out that people fall on sidewalks, trip over tree roots, and when an older person falls and breaks their hip, for example, that's a downward spiral. They go in the hospital, they get depressed, they get pneumonia. And then they go into a nursing home and they have an early death, but that's never called a traffic crash. But it is. It is, and we need to know that so we can figure out ways to solve the problem. So I think I've run over. I'm sorry. That's it.
Thank you.
Right here.
I have a question to start late. Sandy, here is the second bullet, improved vehicles. Any implications?
Yeah.
Autonomous vehicles?
Well, no, I meant before that. So we know, for example, the backup cameras have stopped a lot of crashes by older drivers. Just having a backup camera. And most older drivers are not killed in backup injuries, but still. So in the lane, when you drift out of a lane, the new cars warn you about that. And the signals on your mirrors, new cars have that. So you can better see who's coming up on you. So those of us who do transportation, there's a big fight about how long it's going to be before we have AVs, real stage 5 automated vehicles. And people say to me all the time, oh, well, all the stuff you're worried about, it's not important. We're going to have automated vehicles. I don't think so. And I think it's going to be a long time. And we still don't know if people are going to buy AVs or there's just going to be fleets of them running around in the street and nobody buys one. That's the hope. I'm not very hopeful. I think people will buy them, and seniors will be the last to buy them because they hold on to cars for a long time. So I think there's going to be a very long time that these are still important issues, but cars are going to get smarter.
The early stages of the auto brakes.
Yeah, I think all that stuff is going to help.
Other questions?
Sure. So what do you have in mind for law enforcement in terms of, is it not, I'm sure there's the reporting element so that, we don't miss as many collisions. That probably if they're not asked to write a report for something minor, they probably don't.
Oh, they don't. And it varies by state. Well, the other thing is, it turns out the cops don't really know what the laws are about bicyclists and pedestrians. That's a big one. So we just had, in August, we had the statewide pedestrian safety conference that Texas A&M puts on every year, and it was a great conference this year. And I was in a session with the cops where people were asking, like, at a signal where you have a pedestrian light and a regular light, and the regular light is still green and the pedestrian light is saying don't walk, is it illegal to walk when the pedestrian light says no? And it turns out it depends on the city, because in some places the only light that matters for being legal or not legal is the traffic light, not the pedestrian light. And the cops were arguing in the room among themselves. So and those things are sort of seen as trivial by them because, you know, they want to go out and catch drunk drivers and stuff. But those aren't trivial. If the cops don't even know what the laws are, how are we going to be training from kids on up what their rights are, what they shouldn't be doing, and we need to train. We need to have the cops be giving tickets to people who violate the crosswalk, and to bicyclists who are riding in the. It's illegal to be riding in a crosswalk, but you know, and also to deal with the inherent conflict that no one talks about very much. You know, we say active transportation, but in real life, there's a lot of conflict between pedestrians and cyclists that we have to deal with and address.
Thank you, Sandy. So, next.
Careful. Yeah, you have to step over it. Graceful. Oh, well, you can walk. What in the see now? That's a woman is a problem solver. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm not giving it back.
Do you notice a lot of opportunities that you have to use
I actually
the-
don't know. These are people from the cops were from other parts of Texas.
These switches
And you
are
can tell this, they're not interested. I mean, this is
Yeah.
boring
This
to
is
them,
next.
right? It's beneath them. So that's a problem.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. It's nice to be able to share research in such an intimate setting. So I have been working with Masroor Rahman and Rydell Walthall on a project that explores the implications of regional transportation governance on funding outcomes, investment outcomes in metro regions. Can you see this thing? Should I close that? There we go. Okay. So we've been busily working on assembling data to help us explore this connection between governance and some of the investment decisions that are made by organizations called Metropolitan Planning Organizations. So outline for today is to speak briefly about MPO governance and why we're interested in it, and then speak a bit about flexible funding, which is the outcome that we're able to observe that becomes the way that we can see how metropolitan governance sort of reveals itself in funding decisions. So we'll explain what flexible funding is and why that's of interest, particularly to transit operators. And we will then be looking at how transit operators are represented on MPO boards, because that is kind of the key interest in our study of MPO governance here. In this particular work, we're interested in how transit operators are represented on these regional transportation boards. We'll talk a bit about some of the changes that were instituted by Federal Transportation Law MAP 21 in 2012 regarding transit representation on MPO boards, and some of what we've learned in our documentation of board structures and transit's representation on them. And then we'll talk about how we're trying to bring these two pieces of data together, information about MPO governance and transit's participation in it, and decisions regarding flexible funding. So we have been studying metropolitan planning organizations, which are the regional transportation bodies required by federal law to make long-range regional transportation plans and approve near-term transportation improvement plans, which are essentially the capital program for metro regions in the United States. They are required in every urbanized area where the population hits a threshold of 50,000 or more, and MPOs in regions that are bigger than that, particularly that hit the 200,000 threshold, they have some additional authority to allocate some categories of federal funding directly. So MPOs are pretty important for determining how transportation dollars get spent in the United States. We could have a whole discussion about how important they are, and there are different views about how influential they are. Are they influential kind of in name and rubber stamp only, or are they directly influential? But they do have responsibility for signing off on billions of federal and state funding every year. So we should look to them. Their choices really do shape the prospects for multimodal transportation systems in metro regions. They shape the long-range plans that involve both surface transportation for highways and passenger vehicles and freight, and they also approve plans for transit expenditure in their region. So the issue of how public transportation is accounted for in regional transportation planning is of interest. So what are MPOs? They are actually at their heart decision-making bodies comprised largely of local elected officials, so city and county elected officials representing those local jurisdictions in the region, as well as significant transportation agencies and providers in the regions. They can also include other representatives, perhaps of universities, in some cases if there's a significant university in the region that has plays a role in creating a lot of transportation demand, but largely they are local government elected officials and transportation agencies. They also always include representatives of state transportation departments and federal agencies as well, so Federal Highway Administration or Federal Transit Administration. And these are the boards that approve the long-range plans and the spending plans, or what are called the TIPs, the Transportation Improvement Programs. So we're interested in how these governing boards are comprised and how the structure of these boards impacts regional transportation investment. And we've been sort of working on the data that are needed to study these kinds of questions. So MPOs in the United States are known for incredible diversity. It's hard to find one MPO board that looks like the next. They are reflective of the variety of our metro regions and the underlying cities and counties that comprise them. And we've been interested in looking at the different ways that MPOs represent transit operators on their voting boards. Maybe I'll come back here. Oops, sorry. Federal law has traditionally allowed MPOs to constitute their governing boards as they see fit. There's some basic guidance. There are thresholds of elected officials that have to be on the boards so that we know that this regional body is actually representing the local cities, townships, counties in the area. But beyond that, MPOs have a fair amount, MPOs and states have a fair amount of discretion as to how they constitute their voting boards. So that explains in part why they do have such or display such a wide variety of board and governance structures. So we're interested in the different ways that MPOs represent transit operators on their boards and how common it is for transit operators to have a direct voting seat on the board. That means that, you know, among maybe the 5 counties in a region and maybe 2 primary cities that have voting seats on a board, is there a voting board seat explicitly designated for that region's transit system? And we're interested in understanding whether or not this voting representation has an influence on that region's decisions regarding flexible transportation funding. So, in other words, we'll talk about flexible funding in a minute, but will the MPO be likely to use the discretion it has to transfer funds from what would be traditionally more highway-oriented programs to programs that could be used for transit expenditure? So that is a direct benefit for transit interests, and we want to see if MPOs actually do that, and if having a voting seat on the board makes them more likely to do it. Okay, so flexible funding, what is it? For people who have been somehow acquainted with or in touch with some of the federal funding programs, you've probably heard, among many other acronyms, the acronyms CMAQ and STP or STPBG now. But these are the primary programs known as flexible funding categories among the federal transportation program. And of the monies that the U.S. government provides for transportation expenditure, most of them are tied to explicit transportation modes. So that means that if you are a recipient of interstate maintenance funds or highway performance funds, that you can only spend those monies on highways. If you're a recipient of 5307 monies or 5309 monies, which are categories of transit funding, you can only spend them on transit. But these two categories of funding are different in that they can be used on a range of projects, and they can be flexed over to the Federal Transit Administration for use on transit projects. And they're particularly of interest because a share of these monies gets suballocated to MPOs, particularly the larger MPOs over 200,000, which, as I mentioned before, have more direct responsibility for allocating those monies. So we can look at how, just to give you a sense of these flexible funding programs within the larger federal aid highway program, kind of the main categories of highway spending. This is work that comes from the GAO and also some more recent data from FHWA. So these categories of quote-unquote flexible funding make up about a quarter of the total federal aid highway program. But when you look at how they get spent or flexed, actually a very small share of them get flexed over to transit. So it's that little wedge here on the left of 3%, or on the right as well in more current data that we're interested in.
So the percentage didn't change in the two periods that you were looking at?
No.
But
So
did
this
the
is-
amount, did the absolute amount change?
The dollar amounts do, because, well, I mean, this is the, it's a different span of years. It's
Oh, I see.
so, and the dollars would change just because the underlying authorization changes. If we adjusted for inflation, I'm not sure what would happen, but this is just to point to the monies that we're interested in. We've just beginning to work with the data that we've gotten on flexible funds that have been transferred to FTA. This is data that we had to request through the Freedom of Information Act from USDOT because it's within their FEMIS system and there's no easy way to get it, unfortunately. But what we see here is that of the monies that have been flexed for transit, there are certain states that dominate it. So when we look at this number at these monies at the state level, some states are more successful in doing this, and it's not exclusively, but largely states that have robust transit systems in some metros. And here we also look at the specifically the percent of total available flexible funds in a given state and the share of it that they flex to transit. So if that's clear, New Jersey is a high performer here because of the money that they have that is flexible, they share a good bit, they flex a good bit of it to transit. So those are, on the left are states that are doing more flexing within their ability. So we've also been looking at the representation of transit operators on MPOs, and probably in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this, but just to make a point that prior to MAP 21, the federal transportation law passed in 2012, there really was no guidance or explicit direction about how transit operators should participate in MPOs. And MAP 21 changed this and said that officials of public agencies that administer or operate major modes of transportation in the metro area, including representation by providers of public transportation, was required. And so the USDOT went through an extensive rulemaking process to try to implement this. What we learned and how it was implemented and how transit is currently represented among MPO boards is that there's a direct approach to satisfying this requirement, and that is giving a board seat to the transit operator, a board seat that comes with a vote, and saying this seat is always for the transit operator, or allowing that transit operator to be represented indirectly by a city or county official who's kind of wearing two hats and saying, well, this transit system's in my district and, we're concerned with their interests too, but I'm here mostly for city X, but I'll also represent the transit agency. This rulemaking about requiring MPO boards to have transit seats on the board received a lot of reaction at the time. Most of the MPOs who wrote in during this rulemaking process and provided their responses and comments said, no thanks, leave us alone. We've always gotten to do things the way we want. We'd like to continue to do that. We are also unique that we should be able to reflect our own unique regional circumstances and comprise our board the way that's best. So they really rejected what they saw as federal interference in their ability to constitute the board. Fewer transit operators went on record during this rulemaking process. Most of them went on record for clarification for what it actually meant and how it could be satisfied. But a number of them did very explicitly oppose this two hats approach and say, no, it is much better for transit to have a direct voting seat on the board. That gives us some flavor. So I'm gonna turn it over to Mashroor, who's gonna talk about how we have created a database of governance structures on the MPO board to capture these different elements of transit representation.
Thank you, Dr. Sciara. So now I'm going to talk about how we created the database and some preliminary statistics and findings. So this study about transit representation belongs to a wider inventory of MPO database, and this database consists of these key variables here. For the governance, we are looking the board size, the number of voting seats, the number of non-voting seats, and whether the transit or airport is represented in the board or not. We also look for the committee. MPO has different type of committee like pedestrian and bike committees, airport committees, transit committees. So we look whether MPO has such type of committee. And FHW has a list of MPO and the database regarding the location, their state, population, designation year. These are the basic information we pulled from FHWA database. And we also look for travel demand models, what type of models MPO use, who owns and maintains the model, and whether non-motorized modes are represented or included in the model or not. So this is the key variables. And where did we collect this data? Our main source is the MPO website, individual MPO websites. MPO websites usually include the board roster and the downloadable documents from where we learn who are represented in the board and what is the size of the board. But sometimes the website information is not enough to understand the governance. In such case, MPO bylaws provide a rich source of information. They state who actually is going to represent in the MPO boards, a set of rules that governs the process of representing, for example, the type of voting procedure, whether MPO use weighted voting or not. So these are the detailed information we collected from reviewing the bylaws of the MPOs. The other MPO administrative documents like UPWP, work program, Unified Planning Work Program, and LRTPs. The initial chapters and the appendices usually include the board roster. So that's a good source of information. And for modeling information, we collected the modeling information from LRTP and the travel demand modeling documentation. And in case if we miss any information from the website or in these documents, we try to directly communicate with MPO officials by email, asking them to send their board roster and the bylaws to us. And given this availability of the information, we refined our variable through iterative process. Initially, we had a set of variables, then we narrowed down the variables based on the availability. And our research team, we visited the MPO websites and we checked the consistency and the uniformity of the response from the information, and we set up a coding protocol like yes or no and the drop-down list so that we get a uniform response from the available information on the websites. And then we randomly sort the MPOs based on the population and populate the MPOs one by one to give the input the data. So this is how we created the database for the MPOs, and so far we have 340 MPOs among 404 MPOs. So these are the MPOs we have full set of information, and the rest 64 MPOs we have either partial information or we tried to reach the MPOs, but we did not hear from them. So based on these 340 MPOs, this is the preliminary statistics, and this is the size of the board. And we find that the MPO board size vary greatly depending on the MPOs. The smallest board has 3 and the largest the board is 112, and the average board size is 17, and the distribution is kind of skewed distribution because there are some large MPOs who have extremely very large voting board size. And we also find that it is positively related with the population of the MPOs. MPOs who have very large population usually have more seats in the voting board. It's because as the MPO grow larger, some additional constituencies become eligible to represent in the board. So that's why as the population increase, the board size also increase. And here is the statistics for transit representation, and we find that around 51% of the MPOs transit represented. That means that MPOs have at least one voting seats in their board for transit. And among those MPOs, this is the breakdown of the percentage of the seat held by transit in the voting board. And for the rest of the MPOs, around 49% of the MPOs, transit is not represented. And these statistics is, this 51%, this is slightly higher than the previous findings in Bond and Kramer. They found 45% MPOs transit is represented in 2011. So this is the evidence that these requirements has kind of slightly increased the percentage of representation of transit in their voting seats. And this is the breakdown of the representation based on TMA and non-TMA status. And we find that for TMA, or that means transportation management areas, for TMAs, transit has high representations, around 60%, 59.4% of the MPOs for the TMAs, they have transit seats. But for the non-TMAs, only 42% of the MPOs has transit seats. And as Dr. Sciara was saying, there's two kinds of representation, direct and indirect representation. But while reviewing the bylaws and the documents, we find that for very few MPOs, bylaws has explicitly mentioned which entity should represent transit on the board. So that was kind of difficult for us to distinguish between direct or indirect representation. So this database largely reflects the direct representation. But while reviewing the bylaws and the documents, we find that for some MPOs, transit is represented indirectly. For example, in Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commissions, they have 6 county executive board members who represent in the board, and they also represent their transit because the county operates the transit in their own county. And for the STANCOG, among the they represent the county or their own jurisdiction as well as the transit. And we find around 10 such cases where transit is represented indirectly. And apart from the voting seats in the board, there are other way of representation or participation of transit in the MPO process. MPOs can have non-voting seats as well in the board. 8% of the MPOs have at least a non-voting board. And there might be a dedicated transit committee. We find around 13.5% of the MPOs have such committees, and MPO may represent in technical advisory committees as well. So our next step, what are we going to do in our next stage of this research? We are going to test the hypothesis whether the amount of fund flex for transit in MSA is a function of the transit representation in the voting board or not. And for these, we have requested for the flexible funding data from FHWA in urbanized or MPO level, because they have aggregate structure, but we are more interested in urbanized area or MPO level data. And we are also going to collect the information whether the MPO has transit provider or not. And then we are going to merge these two data sets, flexible funding data and our MPO database, to test whether transit representation in the board influence the funding, flexible funding or not. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Do you have time for questions? Okay, confirmed. It's requiring large MPOs having transit and transit representatives on the seat. This is currently in practice.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, so if you, yeah.
So
So
even
that-
though it's in
Then your
practice, I mean,
database is showing all the MPOs, 340 including all, right? You have one.
So we've looked at, yeah, so
All-
we've tried, so previous research has only looked for surveys. So what we've done is try to establish a comprehensive database. And it's not so any MPO over 200,000, which is the TMA, that's when we were saying non-TMA and TMA. TMA is an MPO in an area with population above 200,000. They have to provide representation for transit operators. But the question arose after MAP 21 was, well, how do you do that? What counts? So we are an MPO board, and if, my county representative, Sandra Rosenbloom from, Hennepin County, there's the Hennepin County Transportation Agency, and, well, she's here on behalf of Hennepin County, but she's gonna represent the transit agency too. So she's gonna
I
wear
see.
two hats.
So this law does not require direct representation.
Exactly.
But
Initially,
indirect may
it
also
seemed
count.
like it did, so the wording, in the statute, made everyone, alarmed and confused, and so there was a rulemaking process to figure out, well, what did this actually mean and how would it be implemented? And so USDOT had to provide further regulatory guidance about explicitly how MPOs would meet this. And they started off with more, a more aggressive stance, saying that it would have to be kind of a dedicated seat, but they backpedaled and allowed for this indirect representation.
In some TMAs may have more than one seat, right? For transit.
For transit
Yeah.
operator,
Because they have multiple transit operators.
well, they may have multiple transit operators, but, unless they're really super big, it's unlikely that they have two voting seats, for the transit operator. Chances are they have one dedicated seat for transit, and they allow those multiple operators to rotate it. It can be a rotating seat sometimes.
Well, I see, so just for clarification, the number of the voting seats does not necessarily equal to the total number of people on the board.
Yes, because there can be ex officio members of the board, but the voting ones are the ones that count for approving the investments.
So y'all are gonna, moving forward, look to see if the boards with the direct transit representation use more flexible spending on transit.
Yes, yeah, that's the aim. Yep.
And that the sorting, the ranking of the states,
Yes.
I did not see Texas. Is Texas on it?
Let's see.
Actually, this
Did,
yeah, because it's a very long chart, so some states cannot be shown in this. Somewhere in between, yes.
So that would suggest that there's not a lot of flex in Texas.
Well, so you have all 50 states.
I think within this small chart we cannot see all the
Right,
49 or
The
50.
labels aren't shown.
Yeah, the labels are not sure. So if the monitor can be
okay.
long, then we
This
could.
would be nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
Texas-
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have multiple indirect seats, will that effect, like equal to if you only have one direct seat, but you don't have any other?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that we'll be able to figure that out, because right now the easiest thing to observe is a direct seat. So what happens is, the MPO, most MPOs have left their board structure alone, and they've said, there's transit in Hennepin County, of course, she's our transit person, we're good, she's representing the transit agency, so, we're good, we complied with the directive, and we haven't changed anything. only very few, as Mashroor said, 10 maybe have explicit language in their bylaws that say, you know, the county representative from Hennepin County will also serve double duty and represent, you know, Hennepin County Transportation Agency.
Yeah.
But most of them don't even provide that level of acknowledgement. So it's kind of an all or nothing as far as we can tell.
What we can observe is whether transit has a dedicated seat or not, but very few bylaws that says, well, they can explicitly represent these two entities. Only for 10 MPOs we find that cases, but mostly they do not say anything in the bylaws.
So the reason that this map 21 was passed, was it because they wanted to make sure that transit was more of a conversation among MPOs, or what was like the reason for the passage?
Well, actually, it was kind of spurred by some of the performance measurement directives within MAP 21. So MAP 21 kind of instituted performance-based planning, more performance-based decision-making, and with MPOs being responsible for developing regional performance measures, there was a sense that, well, okay, the MPO is going to be having to create these performance measures for transit as well. And so we should make sure that transit is a part of this conversation. So it really came out of some of the performance measurement impetuses in MAP 21.
Is Campo formally represented? No, Cap Metro here in Austin. Does Cap Metro have a seat?
Yes, they do have a seat.
Voting seat.
Yes.
Yes.
I wonder if Cap Metro gets more money.
Well, that's the
Yeah,
question, isn't
that's
it?
the question.
Right.
The one thing that we haven't quite figured out yet is how we will measure that flexible funding. Should we look at the flexible, how we'll be able to tell what's the pool of flexible funding available in a region, how we count that, and versus what was actually flexed. So that's a little trickier.
Because it's hard to separate out from the other transit money that came in to transit.
No, if we get the data from FTA, from FHWA, we should be able to know. But it's just what should the measure be? Because should it be absolute dollars?
Why shouldn't it
You
be,
know,
couldn't it be
or-
both?
Could be a share. So, yeah.
I'm a big believer in absolute numbers too. I mean, even if it's only 2%, but it's
Yes.
$800 million,
Yes.
that's more important than
Yes.
being 40% and being 50,000.
Yes. Very true. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think they're both important
Yeah.
in different ways.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, for the interest of time, we have to conclude this session. Thank you again
Okay.
for your presenters, Sandy
Yes.